This session is brought to you by Cersei Dynex, where their new community engagement platform offers you a one-stop shop for all of your library's marketing efforts. Send targeted emails, create an online calendar, and make sure all your messaging has the same look and feel right from your ILS. At Cersei Dynex, they always have the end user in mind. It's what pushes them to continue growing and creating new software and services for libraries. Start harnessing the power of your library's data at cerseidynex.com. Hi, everyone. I'm John Kraska, Executive Director for Every Library and the Every Library Institute. We are your hosts today for the Library Advocacy and Funding Conference, and I'm joined by Helena Burger, who's the retired President and CEO of AAPD, the American Association for People with Disabilities. As a national civil rights organization for people with disabilities, AAPD's role, primarily through communications and grassroots advocacy, is focused on collective action at the local level to effectuate change at the state and national levels. And I'm really excited to be able to bring a conversation forward today with Helena about her experience at AAPD as the president and CEO, as somebody who is very well aware of the matrix of how, influence happens and how leadership needs to be a listening posture as well. I've had the pleasure of working with her and AAPD over the past couple of years as part of their Rev Up campaign and the National Disability Voter Registration Week initiatives. Every library has been a partner in that project, along with many organizations, the state, the local, the state, and the federal levels, in order to, we're going to have a big conversation about what that looks like. They also, in addition to the work that we started with them on Rev Up and the National Disability Voter Registration Week, have a very strong programmatic set of focuses, specifically around youth and leadership development, disability inclusion, increased employment opportunities and outcomes for people with disabilities. Those kinds of programs play a very big role in demonstrating AAPD's impact, influence, and effectiveness. Helena, thank you for being with me today. Like I said a moment ago, we got to know each other a little bit through the advocacy, the direct advocacy work. And AAPD is a civil rights organization, but I'm really interested in why you see that mission, not just about policy or perhaps the courts, or maybe a little bit of grassroots activity like some folks do, but you're a very politically active organization. Where does that come from in terms of your mission, vision, and values?
Well, John, first, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I look forward to this conversation, and AAPD really values the partnership that we have with Every Library and have really made a difference in our National Disability Voter Registration Week activities. From my point of view, and obviously the organizations, I really believe that, obviously people with disabilities have been marginalized. There are over 60 million Americans with disabilities, the largest underrepresented group in the United States. And I think the way to achieve power is through politics. And when I say the politics, it's the voting aspect of it. If you really want to influence and you want to show you have power, I really believe it starts at the ballot box. And that's why AAPD started or really became the national coordinator of Rev Up. Rev Up is really all about building political power and increasing the political power of people with disabilities. I mean, you just have to watch, other groups, be it older Americans. We see now how the campaigns are courting suburban women, Black women. That's not yet happening in our community, and it should. There's a lot of reasons for that, which I won't go into right now. But I think if we can show that we are voting in high numbers and ultimately affecting the outcomes of these elections, be it national, state, local, people in Washington, people in state capitals, the media, I think just society in general, will take our community more seriously. And I also believe that, by voting for candidates who have people with disabilities interests, and part of their platforms, that is also going to effectuate real change. Because if you don't vote these people in, you can run up to every capital, 365 days a week. But if it's not the individuals who are really listening to you and understand your needs, it really falls on deaf ears, so to speak.
You bring up a really good point. I mean, I remember one time going to Washington, D.C. for the Day on the Hill for libraries. And I can't remember who preceded us into the office, but who followed us all over the place that legislative day was the National Headache Association. Now, when I first, I know, I did the same thing. The National Headache Association. And I looked it up on my phone, and my colleague Patrick and I were looking at, and like, okay, they have a mission, vision, and values. They're looking to express that in terms of policy. They're grassroots. They have the T-shirts on, and it reminded me of the fact that well, it's also kind of special interest group, kind of corporate. And that's okay, because sometimes politics is influenced by money, and sometimes it's influenced by people. The people side of it, though, when you have a constituency as large as 65 million Americans, I mean, how do you caucus, if you will, across the different special interests within the disability community? How do you build consensus?
That's a really good question. It's not easy. I do think, I guess I've been doing this work for over 30 years, and I think we're starting to bridge those gaps. I think early on, it was a little harder to coalesce and bring everybody together because, maybe the deaf community, has a particular issue, and the blind community and people with intellectual disabilities. But I think the community realizes we're stronger when we come together. And there are common issues, healthcare, that impacts everybody. Accessibility at the polls affects everybody. Employment issues affects everybody. So you can find common ground with issues that affect everybody. But I think we're also realizing, even as a community, if that particular issue doesn't affect me, I should still support it. Right. And I think, and again, it took us a long time to get there, but that is happening so much more in our community. Again, I think they're realizing there's power in numbers, and we have the numbers, and we need to use that power.
So I was looking the other day at the Rev Up materials, and I went down a little rabbit hole, which you had there, which is the questionnaire for the presidential candidates in the 2020 race. And that was pre-COVID, of course. But the question deck wasn't just from AAPD. If I remember correctly, it was the National Center for Independent Living that did the
National Council.
National Council, my apologies. Yes. And the idea of doing that as a joint project, is that in the DNA of AAPD, or is that something that has evolved over time, that ability to work across different organizations?
No, definitely it was in the DNA. When our founders were thinking about the organization, we are a cross-disability organization. So that means any type of disability. So I think that made us pretty unique. There are not a lot of cross-disability organizations out there. NICL, National Council on Independent Living, is also a cross-disability organization.
Okay.
So I think that was really at the founding, of AAPD, to think of us as this umbrella organization, and to pull a very diverse group of people with disabilities into the fold, because again, that's only going to make us stronger.
Right, and I think the idea of an oldest and largest, or a broad, makes a lot of sense. The tension, though, between sort of a whole cloth, comprehensive approach, both to policy as well as to your programming, versus chasing your tail a little bit, though. And I'm not suggesting that you are at all. I don't think you do. I think you're extremely effective. But how do you, as a leader and as a manager of people, keep it from getting too drifting, too many competing interests? I'm just interested as a leader, how you navigate that.
Yeah. So, from my perspective, obviously most nonprofits, you have limited capacity, be it capital or human, right? And knowing that, that's finite, I think, you have to look at your mission, and you have to look, I think, where the biggest impact is. And I think we decided when we were looking, from a policy standpoint, where we're going to really focus our energy. A lot of that was around healthcare. A lot of that was around employment issues. A lot of that was around voting issues. Again, all feeding into our mission to increase political and economic power. And that's not to say, we are an organization that's part of other coalitions, so it becomes easy to sign on to letters that go up to Capitol Hill. But in terms of what we were really going to focus on, I think we were very deliberate so that we could be more successful and have better outcomes than, like you say, being all over the place. Right. And we recognize that. And I also recognize, especially when I came back to APD over the last 4 years and served as president and CEO, I think you need to realize there are a lot of other players in this space, in the disability space. So you need to carve out your niche. What do you do well? What do you do best? And that also means, the issues you're going to be working on, the programs you want to be focusing on. And again, I think, right, if it is this, swath, you're just not as effective.
Yeah, the first time I was on a call for the National Disability Voter Registration Week, and National Disability Voter Registration Week, folks, is the middle week of July every year. For the last couple of years, it's focused on getting people with the mission is getting people with disabilities registered to vote is the first step to increasing the political power of people with disabilities. And I got to tell you, I was on this call where folks were serving a community in one zip code. There are folks who were part of a state table and a state organization, and folks who were on the call leading other national organizations that are focused on human rights, civil rights, employment, et cetera. And to see the diversity of that call in terms of the way that, or from the mix, not the diversity, but the mix of the different organizations that are involved in your big tent, your umbrella, it's really impressive. So Rev Up as a political campaign that has a policy focus, okay? And that's covering a number of different organizations in your big tent, your umbrella, very focused on coalition and partnership. But then the tactical nature of the National Disability Voter Registration Week, I'm really impressed by that. And I'm wondering what moved you from just doing a policy framework and white papers and signing letters to actually doing something that was active voiced like that, to do a voter registration drive.
Right. So, I look at APD as really, we're national, but we're about working with the grassroots. We're about working and organizing the grassroots. Rev Up, in my opinion, serves many purposes. One, again, is to build that political power, show the influence of people with disabilities. It's also to organize. It's a great organizing tool around the country. National Disability Voter Registration became a tool to organize. In addition to achieving the purpose of getting more people with disabilities registered, engaged in civic participation, starting to have that conversation, starting to understand the importance, it was a really great organizing tool. It was a great way to reach out to partners around the country in and outside the disability community. It wasn't just within the disability community. So for example, like League of Women Voters, we reached out to Rock the Vote. And as time has gone on, we've expanded, more what I would call, quote unquote, mainstream organizations that are doing voting work. So again, it was, yes, we have to get people with disabilities, registered, but we also have to figure out how do we do that? And again, National Disability Voter Registration Week became a perfect tool. We also thought it was a good way to sort of maybe wake up the media a little bit and make them aware that there is this constituency out there. In this next election, there are going to be over 30 million eligible people with disabilities that can vote. And you start considering family members, it brings it to over 60 million, right? Which is about a quarter of the electorate. Just think how powerful that would be.
Absolutely.
If the vast majority were voting. It's mind-blowing. And that's really what Rev Up is all about.
I think that the power that comes from having individuals enfranchised, and then the influence that comes from a national organization like AAPD, or a coalition of national, state, and local organizations, advancing the issues around ballot access, I mean, I'm nervous about this whole conversation happening. We're recording end of August here for this, so I don't know where things are going to be at with the post office, you know. But I also know that COVID's not going away anytime soon, and all the issues around being able to access a ballot, to be able to vote in person is very important, as well as to be able to vote either absentee or by mail, because we want to maximize enfranchisement. But to vote independently, that's an area that I think a lot of folks who do not have disabilities don't understand.
Right. No, I totally agree with you. I think, having a fair and safe election come November is something we're all striving for. I'll be honest right now, I'm not sure we're going to have that. Like you said, we see what's happening with the United States Postal Service. Just look what happened with the primaries. Long lines, poll closures. I know in Georgia, I think the court stopped it, but I remember they were purging the voting rolls.
Right.
If you haven't voted for a year or 2 years. I mean, in the disability community, access has always been an issue. It continues to be an issue. It's getting better, but it's still a huge issue. Polling place may not be accessible. Bad training of polling workers. The equipment, the voting machines may not be accessible. So there are, a host of issues certainly that people with disabilities face that we've been, barriers that we've been facing for, decades. Right. Now, on top of that, we really have voter suppression, which also affects our community and many other communities, and certainly communities of color. It's documented. We can't deny this. I know there are deniers out there, but it is well documented. Again, just look at 2016, look at 2018 election, and then just look at the primaries, what happened. I mean, look at those lines.
Absolutely. And some of those, COVID-related concerns, like in Ohio, where they, at the 11th hour, they pushed the election to be a later date. That didn't invalidate the election. That was an attempt at enfranchisement, and it was a little clumsy, perhaps. But when it's a systemic approach to degrading the ability for people to access the ballot, that's an extraordinary concern.
And one thing to be thinking about. Our community is certainly for mail-in ballots, but right now mail-in ballots are not accessible for individuals who are blind and maybe some who are low vision. So again, we need to be thinking about how mail-in ballots are going to be accessible, for everyone.
Right.
Which again, these are issues sometimes that get overlooked. Although I do think, the one thing I would say after doing this so many years is I do see candidates thinking a little more about our constituency. I mean, you see disability in platforms. You certainly see it in the DNC platform. And not to get partisan here, but I think you do see it in the Democratic candidates talking about it more, and recognizing there is a constituency here. And that's what this is really about. Right.
I read something. I think it was NCIL. How do you pronounce their acronym again? Nickel. Nickel put out a study the other day about the percentages of elected officials who are people with disabilities versus the general population, and there's a significant percentage difference. The number of people who are themselves living with disabilities, experiencing disabilities, either permanent or temporary, who are in elected office is a lot smaller than the general population. And I think you can see that. It's 30 years since the ADA, and we're still in a mode where people are organizations, facilities, technologies are grandfathered in to don't worry about the ADA. What kind of country do we live in sometimes?
Yeah, no, unfortunately, that's the reality. I mean, we just literally had, the 30th anniversary of the ADA on July 26th. And I'm not going to say the ADA, we certainly have progressed because of the ADA. So I don't want people to think I'm not saying that. But there are so many areas where we haven't. Certainly employment is one of them. When you look at the employment statistics, it's abysmal for people with disabilities. And Title I of the ADA is all about employment and making sure that, if you're a qualified person with a disability, with or without an accommodation, you should be afforded the job. And we're still fighting now, for non-discrimination in the workplace, disability inclusion in the workplace, the right accommodations. I mean, on and on and on. So, but again, I go back to Rev Up and voting. That's why voting becomes so important. I think about John Lewis, and I think about what he said so many times, that voting is the best non-violent tool we have in our democracy. And it's really true. For me, I really believe this at my core. I know AAPD does, but if you really want to effectuate change, you have to go vote. You've got to vote people in who care about your interests. Right. Otherwise, we're not going to see change. It's not going to happen by osmosis. It's just not. And to your point, what Nickel is doing, matter of fact, the woman at Nickel who runs that program where they're trying to get more people to run for office with disabilities, she was one of our Paul G. Hearn, who was a founder of APD awardees, and we gave her $10,000 to help her continue that project. But that, this whole civic participation issue is very big. APD, sort of has our slice of it. Nickel is doing their thing. There's a phenomenal group online called Crypt the Vote.
Yes.
Which I was assuming by now you're probably aware of. And, they're doing phenomenal work around, again, civic participation and people with disabilities. So for somebody who's been doing this work for 30 years, that has not always been the case. It has been sort of hard to get our community and organizations really engaged in this. I think because, with so many other things impacting people with disabilities, it just never became a priority. I do think our current political environment has made it more of a priority. Sure. But I am just, like I say, just really pleased to see how many more organizations, how many more individuals with disabilities, and more of the mainstream, like I say, voting organizations are starting to think about, people with disabilities. And they'll admit, like, well, yeah, we really haven't thought about that. Well, so we're starting to see a change.
I mean, there's a good mission statement, top level, very pithy, that AAPD has, which is that you see yourselves as a convener and a connector. And I like that. There's an abundance to that. There's not a scarcity, but to be a convener and a connector, you have to have some sort of a theory around coalition work or theory around partnership. I'm interested just from the not AAPD specifically, but in general, like what makes you tick around coalition work?
Yeah. So, I think the coalition work is, you want to have that big tent. You want to have people's voices. You want to have people's engagement. You want to have people, buy-in. You want to have those people sitting around the table. When we changed the mission statement, which included being a connector and a convener, connector, catalyst for change.
Catalyst, I forgot about that. Right? That's a great word. Yes.
Right. So that, I think, really embodies AAPD and a lot of what we're talking around coalition building. So to be a convener, we were thinking you bring that very broad, diverse group of people with disabilities to the table. The connector piece is you start connecting this broad, diverse community, business community, public officials, academia, our adversaries, they're out there. And you start having a dialogue, because nothing changes without that dialogue. Agree or disagree, the exchange of ideas is really important. And maybe you can persuade somebody, right? You can persuade somebody, well, no, that's not right. That is really discriminatory. And maybe they never even thought about it as being discriminatory. Or maybe they thought it was an insurmountable obstacle that if you sit down and you start having this conversation, I think we can figure out a way to get around this. So I think the coalition building and the partnerships are essential.
Yeah, I think that the theory of change, theory of coalition work in order to accomplish any goal. I mean, you said adversary, which I think is a really bold statement. Sometimes I use the euphemism frenemy. But to be able to have a dialogue where you're willing to have more than you know, so my grandma used to talk about the people in the world who would have to blow out your candle so their candle could shine brighter. I don't see that as being coalition positive.
No.
Yeah.
No.
So let me go down a little rabbit hole here, because I know from not just working with you folks on National Disability Voter Registration Week, and not just you're receiving your newsletters and listening to you to talk, and watching your policy work, the grassroots side of it is completely 100% authentic. But I also know you've got a hell of a board, and you throw really good parties with a lot of corporate sponsors. And one of our points of admiration for your work is honestly the fact that you've brought corporate partners and foundation and philanthropic partners to this conversation as part of that catalyst, I would guess. Though I don't see them being quiet either. They're definitely part of the coalition, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, AAPD has been really fortunate with our corporate relationships and partnerships. But again, I think it's been an evolution for companies. That has not always been the case, especially, you think about D&I, diversity and inclusion in companies. Yes, you thought about women, you thought about people of color, then it was the LGBTQ community. Now it's like people with disabilities, again, they need to be at the table. So it's made it somewhat easier to start building those relationships and partnerships with foundation, because they're realizing, I think from two perspectives. From a philanthropic perspective, it's the right thing to do. We need to support this community. I also think they realize from a business perspective, through our Disability Equality Index, there's been some studies done that shows that companies that are more disability inclusive have a higher rate of return, have a higher bottom line.
Interesting.
Yep. So like I said, it's philanthropic. It makes good business sense. And a lot of companies, as baby boomers like myself are retiring, and that's only going to be growing, looking to a new workforce. Well, there are a lot of very talented people with disabilities that can fill that void. So you have a convergence of all of that, and you have a lot of corporations who are willing to work with us and be part of that coalition.
So partially it's for their own workforce, partially it's the enlightened self-interest around value that they deliver, partially it's about the consumer market.
The bottom line.
The bottom line. I mean, it's a triple win for them to be aligned with you as a mission-driven organization.
And again, I view it as a relatively new phenomenon, but
so can I ask?
Sure. No, go ahead.
So, I'm just being really honest with you here, and you and I have had this discussion a little bit before about the library community. We are not necessarily putting ourselves in a position to understand that these companies, these corporations, these Fortune whatevers, are mission aligned with literacy and workforce and reading and community development, all the good things that the public libraries do, or on the school library side or on the academic library side. For some reason or other, we have not been looking to them as partners. Did it require AAPD leadership to kind of come around to it, or has that been something that you've been waiting for the corporate community? You said it's a recent development. Were you waiting for them to come around to you? Like, what's the?
Well,
the
I guess when I say recent, I'm just talking about sort of the corporate community in general. That this has been a work in progress, and now you're really seeing more and more corporations really embrace disability inclusion. Like they're sort of getting it.
Yeah. So you guys were ready. They finally came around.
Yeah, they came around. I think the ADA certainly had something to do with it, right? Because there's compliance factors within the ADA. But yeah, I think they came around, and I think to the credit of the APDs of the world and the disability community in general is starting that dialogue with corporate America and having them realize, like, yeah, when you talk about DEI and people with disabilities are not at that table, you're missing 60 million Americans. That's right. And I think, again, not all, but they are really starting to get that. The Disability Equality Index that we have, which is an index for companies to gauge where they are on the disability inclusion spectrum. This year, over 200 corporations took the Disability Equality Index.
That's great.
Which is pretty huge for us. Like, I know the Human Rights Campaign has their equality index, and, they have a much higher rate of companies taking it. They've been at it much longer. But the DEI that we do in partnership with Disability In has only been around for a few years. And when we started the pilot, I think we had under 50 companies, maybe 25 companies, 15, I forget now. Now we're over 200.
And
so
it starts to build the base, and it starts to move the needle. That's really fantastic. So let me pivot for a minute, if I could, around back to you personally. We've been talking about the organization a lot, and sometimes when you're the executive director, the president, the CEO, there's not a lot of daylight. You're answering emails at 2:00 in the morning on a Sunday. I know that. But what makes you tick as a leader? Like, I'm really interested in, like, how did you catch this particular bug, like your career trajectory?
Yeah.
I'm just kind of interested.
Yeah, I love that question. That's why you should have a big smile on my face. So full disclosure, I'm not a person with a disability. I didn't really have a connection when I started this 30 years ago. I was a political science major. I thought getting out of college what I wanted to, or I knew I wanted to do like government relations type of work. And I sort of fell into this. When I left college, I actually had an interview on Wall Street, and for the first 5 years or so of my career, I was in that business. To be honest, really despised it, but first job out of school, and then I moved out of New York and moved to the Philly, Southern New Jersey area. And I was like, okay, this is an opportunity to get back on my career trajectory. So I was looking in the Sunday paper, the Philly Inquirer, and there was a position, an advocacy position. But remember, this is not DC, this is Philly. You don't see a lot of those type of positions for an organization called Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association, which is now United Spinal Association. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go for this. Long story short, I got the advocacy position. It was my first introduction to disability rights. And to be honest,
so it was on the job training for you.
Yes, it was my first. Yeah, and to be honest, now I look back, I'm a little embarrassed, but I think for people who are not connected to disability on a personal level, they're where I was. I was somebody who I thought was enlightened about civil rights. And then I came across this whole community who day in and day out, and this was just pre-ADA by a couple of years, but day in and day out were discriminated, completely marginalized, getting on a bus, can't get on a bus.
Curb. Who had a curb cut?
Yeah, a curb cut, right. You want to go shopping, you can't get through the door. These are things, if you're a wheelchair user, and obviously United Spinal was focused on that. And this whole world literally opened up. And even when I talk about it now, I don't know if it comes through, I hope it does, but I just became so passionate about
it does come through, absolutely.
Disability rights. And that's how I fell into it. Again, I think being a political science major, somebody who was always interested in politics, somebody, growing up in a family where we talked about this stuff and social justice. So some of it was part of that DNA. But then, like I say, falling into that advocacy, my first advocacy position with EPVA, and, and understanding this movement. And also just for myself, just how some of those stereotypes and myths and barriers about people with disabilities, I realized, people with disabilities, they're like you and me, okay, maybe they can't walk, so they'll use a wheelchair. They can't talk, so it's sign language, and even people with more severe disabilities. I mean, it was just a whole new world that opened up, and it was something that I became incredibly passionate about. And like I said, I really couldn't think of a better career, because I knew I was getting up every day and doing the right thing. I never doubted from day one that, somebody could tell me the work I'm doing isn't right.
When you look at guiding principles in somebody's life, I was asked this the other day in an interview for a magazine about what's your guiding principles. And, it got me thinking about what gets me up in the morning, to do the kind of work. And you and I share a little bit of a common path in our biography. I'm not a librarian. I've never worked in a library. I'm not qualified to do story times. You would not want to put me in front of children. I don't really like them very much, but as accidental careers go, I think that the two of us are lucky,
This is really not a word I use a lot. It's really not me, but I'll use the word blessed.
Sure.
Because I really do. I almost feel like it was meant to be. I saw that ad.
Mm-hmm.
I said, I'm just going to go for it.
Yeah.
I got the job. And, again, the rest is sort of history.
Mm-hmm.
But
so,
I couldn't think, I could not think of, doing anything else but what I did for the last 30 years.
One of the things I've been asking other people in this leadership conversation series for the conference is around, the difference between what your hard skills are and your soft skills are as a leader, and the on-the-job aspect of your training is fascinating to me, but I got to imagine it's the soft skills that matter even more than the hard skills, regardless of what the issue is. Yes, you got to be properly briefed if there's a bill or there's a draft moving or if there's a piece of legislation or whatever, but you don't get to this point of building and focusing power without being able to work with humans.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I think those hard skills when it comes to, the managing part, the budget part, all the fiscal issues, if you don't initially have those skills, you'll figure it out.
Yeah, you can pick
but
them
some
up.
of those, like you say, the soft skills, which are the people skills, a lot of times, like, you either have it or you don't. We see, I think it's a perfect example. And again, this is not getting political, but I think it's a good example. Just look at this race right now. We're sitting here while the Democratic National Convention is happening, and look how Biden, right, the image of him and how they're portraying him. If those aren't, those soft people skills, what is? That's not to say he doesn't come with tremendous experience. I am not undercutting that. But to the point that you're saying, they're trying to contrast him with the man that's sitting in the Oval Office. And that contrast, as much as he has the competency, they are really focusing on those soft skills, those people skills, the humanity, the compassion. And I think when you do this work, I think when you do this advocacy work, you have to be able to relate to people. You have to be adaptable. You have to be flexible. And sometimes what was really hard, and you just have to, you swallow hard. Yeah, you have to be able to sit down with somebody who doesn't agree with you and try to figure it out.
That's really, really key. So
as much as you want to punch him in the face.
I understand that too. I'm not a, this isn't a leading question. I don't know what the right answer is, but like, do you pay attention to to thought leaders? Do you have a management guru? Are you somebody who reads widely, or are you like, I wake up in the morning, I'm going to go get something done?
So, you know what, in terms of the thought leaders, one of the things I do every day is I read the New York Times and I read the Washington Post. So I love, looking at like the Paul Krugmans of the world, who's, an opinion writer for the Post. I love looking at the Thomas Friedmans of the world, the Maureen Dowds, even like the George Wills, who is on the opposite side of, the spectrum, the John Meachams and the Doris Turner Goodwins of the world, who, are the historians. So those are the people sort of I gravitate to. Again, I think it has that political tilt because I am this political junkie.
Right.
But those are the people I tend to gravitate. I'll be honest, it's not as much the management. I guess for me, to be honest, I went so much about gut, what I just thought was right.
I'm sorry, your gut.
My gut.
Yeah.
My gut from a management standpoint. And to be honest, I'd say 99% of the time, it didn't steer me wrong. And that's not to say you don't have mentors along the way and you're bored, but it was just good common pragmatic
Yeah, yeah,
sense,
yeah.
and I think, and it worked.
I'm asking that question because I'd like to actually hear what you're thinking. There's no right or wrong on it. I am, of course, looking for recommendations for other books, though, because I'm always looking for the cheat sheet. So let's talk a little bit about, if we could, as we're kind of turning the corner here on this conversation today, a little bit about vision. Okay, we talked a lot about strategy. We talked a little bit about leadership. You have several, I think, important working theories about your approach to getting things done and to build a bigger tent, a bigger umbrella. But I'm just worried about I'm worried right now. I mean, we're in the middle of well, I don't know where we are. Might be beginning, middle. God help us, COVID. Okay, I'm looking at things from the perspective of hope's in a little short supply right now. That's just me personally. I'm not ascribing that to you. But how do you see it? Is this a hopeful time because we're breaking some eggs and things are getting leveled out, or is this if we don't get our heads out of our wherevers? How are you feeling?
So, I think it's a mixed bag. I think there's a lot of despair, right, for a host of reasons, especially with COVID and the racial strife that we just went through.
Mm-hmm.
People are physically, being impacted, emotionally being impacted, financially being impacted. We have a government where, the Senate left town before, passing another relief bill.
I know, it's crazy.
Which is crazy. But nevertheless, they've done that. So I understand the despair and the lack of hope, but there's something that, I've been thinking about a long time in the political environment we've been in since the last election. I think the silver lining is that it was a wake-up call. I think during the Obama years, a lot of communities got complacent.
A lot of progressive communities did, yeah.
A lot of progressive communities got complacent.
Because I was watching the libertarians and the conservatives get organized.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And now, there's been the resistance movement. There have been marches and peaceful protests. And I think that's all really positive. Again, I go back to John Lewis because he's been so much in my mind and brain lately since his passing. But, good trouble, necessary trouble. If you see something, do something, say something. And I think we see that happening. And that gives me hope. That gives me a lot of hope in the time over the last few years, to be honest, and certainly the last 6 months, where you can feel hopeless and you can feel, like I say, a lot of despair. But again, when I think of sort of the rising up, and look at the young people, look what they did, around gun control, the ownership of that, their voices around around climate change. I mean, these are things that make us hopeful. And even though it's hard to be hopeful, I think we have to be. And again, to me, this translates or goes back to why it's important on November 3rd, to make sure you voted, however you do it, in person, in mail, if you really want that hope to continue, there needs to be a change, and not just on the national level. I mean, I'm talking about up and down the ballot. So, I hope people can view the glass half full instead of half empty, even though it's a really hard time. Probably, in my lifetime, one of the most, difficult times that I can remember in this country.
I want to go back to the 30 years anniversary for the ADA and think through a little bit about where common ground comes from. The vision, of a sitting down with your adversary, your frenemy. I don't know, Helena. It's progressives have one kind of language, conservatives have another, libertarians have another. There's a whole group of folks who are out there looking to just burn the place down in order to save it. I mean, maybe I'm glass half empty still, but I want to ask this question. You look at the ADA and you look at progress that's been made on healthcare, on workforce, on education, on ballot access. You look at places where we've slid back. I mean, it sometimes to me looks like maybe we're not making progress because we're not talking to each other. I also sometimes think that there are forces out there that don't want to see progress be made. They want to make sure that there's still divisions between the progressives, the conservatives, and the libertarians. Because I don't know anybody who doesn't care about at least some other humans. So how do we, as part of a movement, as leaders, in libraries, it's supposed to be a neutral environment. At least some people think that libraries are neutral. Everything gets on the shelf, then you make your own choices. But libraries fundamentally are not, neutral. The posture around access is a political posture. Censorship is a political posture. And being anti-censorship. I'm not exactly sure what kind of question I've got here, other than just wanting to hear what your thoughts are around, is there common ground? Is this a time for common ground? Or what do we have to watch out for those forces that want to keep people divided?
So, through a disability lens, we always say, disability touches everybody. It shouldn't be a Republican issue and it shouldn't be a Democratic issue, right? It's an issue, again, that impacts everybody, including you and me, who I'm assuming you don't have a disability. As we age, mobility, hearing, sight, who knows what. The ADA never would have passed. It was a bipartisan piece of legislation that passed, because of bipartisanship. A lot of that is out the window, although I don't think we should give up, but I think realistically it is really difficult. We're so divisive. As a country, on Capitol Hill, it's really hard. I don't think that doesn't mean we should give up. So that's one side of the story. Again, the other side of the story, if you want to be more partisan and you want to see change, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but that's why voting is important. If you want to have, the president and Congress and something that yet has been discussed at the Democratic convention, which is a crucial issue, court appointments, to see real social change, it happens at the ballot box. Again, people need to realize this doesn't, again, as I said earlier, it doesn't happen through osmosis. We have to do our part. We have to elect those people who we believe are going to have the change that we want to see. Because, depending what happens in November, we may get that change. It may not be on a bipartisan level. It may be very partisan, but we can actually see some real change. Although I still don't think we should lose all hope in working, across the aisle.
Well, I think that's a really noble view. I really do. The idea of turning apathy into action is what I'm hearing you talk about a lot. And that's, there's a resigned apathy sometimes. There's an active voiced, I don't care, I don't want to care, apathy. But turning somebody from being callous into compassionate is also something I've heard you say in one way, shape, or form here today. So I want to have a last kind of closing question, if I could. This is a library conference. So I need to I've talked about this before with you. The Chicago way of giving advice is either to say, I got a guy, your radiator's broken, I got a guy, but the other way we love giving advice here in Chicagoland, in some places, maybe in Philly.
I'll just use one say, I'm from New York. I think it's very similar.
If I was you, if I was you, I want to hear your "if I was you" to librarians, whether it's a public library that is sitting at that nexus of connecting people. If it's an academic library on campus, if it's a school library, what if it was the "if I was you" moment here for librarians? What should they be paying attention to through this disability lens, but more so the apathy into action lens?
Yeah. So, I thought a little bit about this before the call because I had a sense you were going to ask me this. And I think it goes back to building that coalition, being part of the dialogue, and making sure you are, making sure that, you're reaching out to, if you're a school library, folks on campus, or, PTA, right? Make sure you have a presence maybe with the PTA. Make sure you have presence with your business leaders, your local business leaders, your local chamber of commerce. I think be proactive, bring those folks together, educate them about the issues, educate them why it's important to support your local library. I think about something that Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm said, who was the first Black woman to be elected to Congress from New York. She said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair.
There you go.
And that's what librarians need to do. If you're not at that table, make sure you are. Make sure you're engaging those folks who can support you, your allies, your stakeholders. It's not easy. I mean, the other thing doing this advocacy work is, as you know, it's a slog. I mean, it's a long road. It's evolutionary. It doesn't usually happen overnight. But, I think we can look to, leaders like John Lewis, right, who, you just keep at it and you get into that, good trouble. You say something, you do something, and you also do it with that compassion and love in your heart. Here's a man who had every reason to be angry and bitter, and he really did it with love and compassion. And we need more of that. I mean, I hope this doesn't sound hokey. I really hope it doesn't, because I think these are the things we're lacking. But again, getting more directly back to your question, I really think be proactive. Make sure you have a seat at the table. Create that table. Like I said, reach out.
And then just from a practical, because we back to the beginning, you're talking very strategically. And sorry, it's a follow-up to my last question. That's always the best, isn't it? When it's like, I got one more question after the question, like Columbo here. But I know from being at that table with AAPD on some of your voting rights initiatives, that there's an awful lot of disability rights infrastructure at that zip code level, and that the public libraries in particular and the campus libraries in particular are rooted at that zip code level. And I also see states where there's state organizations, and we have a lot of state library people, state library associations participating in the conference today, or this week. Like, where do people start to look? What's the keyword search? Like, where do we pay attention to start actually showing up for our neighbors who have disabilities, who are living with disabilities? How do we start showing up?
So I think a great place to start. So we talked about the National Council on Independent Living. They're the umbrella organization for independent living centers. Those are organizations run for and by people with disabilities. They're civil rights organizations. They provide programs and services, provide a host of different services and activities for people in the community. They're grassroots. All are, on the grassroots. So with 700 of them around the country, chances are librarians
you got somebody in your backyard
could hook up with their local independent living center.
Okay.
And that it's ilru.org, I think.
You're fantastic. We'll look it up. We'll put it on the
But
right
you can get a listing of all the independent living centers around the country. I think that's a really good place to start to try to plug in. And they're not just independent living centers. I mean, there are a host of disability organizations on the state and local level. But with independent living, I mean, the infrastructure's there, and I think that's a really good place to start.
That's a great tip. Thank you. So we actually did do both, If I Was You and I Got a Guy. So congratulations. We made it happen. So we stuck the landing. Congratulations. Folks, I really want to thank Helena Burger, immediate past president and CEO of AAPD, the American Association of People with Disabilities, for spending some time with us today to talk about leadership, to talk about their mission, vision, and values, and to talk about some of the fantastic accomplishments that she has helped that organization do, not just independently, but as part of a big coalition. Thank you for being with me today. It was a real joy to be able to have this chat.
Same here. Thank you.
Okay. Cheers.
Bye-bye.